A blacksmith knows the difference between metal that can be reforged and metal that's too weak to hold an edge. I learned the same about people the night I found out about my wife's affair. My name is Elias Holt. I'm 52 years old. I run Holt & Sons Forge in Ironwood, a town where people still tip their hats in greeting and shake hands like they mean it. My father ran the forge before me, and his father before him. Some folks say I belong to the fire more than I do the town, but I take that as a compliment. Steel doesn't lie to you. It bends, it breaks, or it holds. People aren't always that simple. That's what I was thinking about when Wade O'Connor strolled into my forge one afternoon, talking a mile a minute like he always did. Busy as hell today, huh? He leaned on the counter, brushing soot off his khakis, which was a waste of time. I swear, you're the only guy in this town who works harder than me. Well, maybe except Charlotte, but I guess she's been keeping busy in the city. Huh. I kept hammering, working the blade under the heat. What do you mean? He waved a hand. Oh, I saw her last week. Took a tour group out to Bellington. She was there, walking along River Street with some guy, real clean-cut type. You know, business casual, one of those guys who's always got his sleeves rolled up like he's working when he's not. Wade chuckled. Didn't think much of it. Figured it was work stuff. But now that I think about it, she seemed real into their conversation. The hammer came down hard. Harder than it needed to. Wade didn't notice. Anyway, just thought it was funny. Didn't know she was making trips out there so often. Man, Bellington's a hell of a place. Full of tourists, but the food's good. Ever been to Red Mill Tavern? Best damn steak. I set the hammer down and wiped my hands on a rag. You got work to do, Wade? He laughed, backing toward the door. All right, I'll let you get back to it. Just saying, town's got eyes, you know? You take care, Elias. I nodded, watching him leave. The heat from the forge was nothing compared to the fire building in my gut. Charlotte had never mentioned Bellington. I didn't believe in gut feelings. You learn early on in blacksmithing that instincts can get you burned if you don't back them up with facts. So I waited, paid attention. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched her. She left the house earlier, stayed later at work, started setting her phone face down on the counter. Nothing outright damning, but enough to keep me quiet and watchful. I didn't ask questions. Didn't let on that I noticed. If she wanted to play a game, I'd play it better. The break came when she slipped up, when she came home late one night and dropped her purse on the counter. Her phone lit up with a message before she could grab it. Had a great time tonight. Same place next week? I didn't touch the phone. Didn't need to. I already knew. She looked up, catching me watching. Her expression was tired, like she'd been carrying something too heavy for too long. She forced a smile. You okay? I nodded. Long day at the forge. She hesitated, then turned away. I sat at the table, staring at the grain of the wood, at the place where our son once carved his initials when he was 10 years old. A blacksmith knows the difference between metal that can be reforged and metal that's too weak to hold an edge. Charlotte was about to learn the same thing. The next morning, I went about my day as usual. Woke up before dawn, poured my coffee, and left for the forge while Charlotte was still asleep. The fire was already lit when I arrived, the heat swallowing the cold morning air. I let the motions take over, preparing orders, shaping iron, hammering steel into something useful. Work clears the mind, keeps a man steady. But not that day. That day, I thought about her phone lighting up, about the message she never expected me to see. I didn't confront her. Not yet. A man doesn't strike before he's certain the metal is ready. So I took my time. That weekend, when she said she had errands to run, I waited 10 minutes after she left, then followed. She took the highway out of town, headed straight for Bellington. I kept my distance, stayed 2 cars behind. She pulled into a cafe on River Street, parked, and walked in without looking back. 5 minutes later, he showed up. Daniel Harris. I knew the name, had seen him around town. Soft hands, soft voice, the kind of man who sits behind a desk all day and thinks he understands the world. I watched him pull out a chair for her, lean in when he spoke, like every word she said was the most important thing he'd ever heard. She smiled at him, smaller than the smiles she used to give me, but real enough. I sat in my truck, watching, waiting. When they left the cafe, they walked down to the river, close but not touching. She turned her face toward him when he spoke, and he nodded like he understood everything she'd ever been through, like he was what she needed. They were careful. They didn't hold hands. They didn't kiss. But I knew what I was looking at. I'd seen men step out of line before. I didn't follow them any further. I had what I needed. That night, she came home like nothing had happened. She stood in the kitchen making tea, her back to me. "Long day at the forge?" she asked, same as always. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Yeah. Lot of orders." She stirred her tea. "You okay?" "Fine." She glanced at me, searching for something, but I gave her nothing. After a second, she turned back to her cup, fingers tapping against the ceramic. I let the silence sit between us. Let her wonder. By the next morning, I had a plan. I didn't work in half measures. A bad blade isn't worth fixing, it's worth melting down and reforging from scratch. So I called Daniel's wife. Her name was Margaret. I'd never spoken more than a few words to her, but I knew her type. Practical, efficient, the kind of woman who kept things running while her husband played pretend at being the sensitive intellectual. When she picked up the phone, I got straight to the point. "This is Elias Holt. We need to talk about your husband." There was a pause, just long enough to tell me she already suspected something. Then, a quiet, steady, "Go on." I told her where to be that evening. I spent the rest of the day at the forge, working like usual. When Charlotte got home, I was at the table, setting out plates. "We having company?" she asked, eyebrows raised. I nodded. Thought it'd be nice. Invited a couple folks over. She hesitated just for a second, then set down her bag. "All right. Who's coming?" "Daniel and Margaret Harris." She froze. Just for half a breath. Then she smiled, forced and tight. "Oh, that's unexpected." I met her eyes. "Yeah. Figured it was time we all sat down together." She swallowed, nodded, then turned to the fridge like nothing was wrong. But I saw it. The way her hands shook when she reached for a bottle of wine. By the time the Harris arrived, the tension in the room was thick. Margaret walked in first, calm and collected, but I saw the way her eyes flicked to her husband, sharp and knowing. Daniel was stiff, his smile too forced. Charlotte, to her credit, kept her expression neutral. We sat. We ate. Small talk stretched thin over the silence. Then I pulled out my phone and set it on the table. "I thought we could watch something," I said, scrolling through my photos. "Took a little trip to Bellington last week. Caught some interesting sights." Charlotte set her fork down, her face pale. Daniel's fingers tightened around his glass. Margaret just watched, waiting. I hit play. The cafe. The river walk. Charlotte smiling up at Daniel like he was something special. Their careful, deliberate distance. A few murmurs from other tables. The weight of silence settled over the room. I leaned back in my chair, looking at Daniel. "You always lean in that close when you talk to another man's wife, or just mine?" Charlotte whispered, "Elias." I didn't look at her. Didn't need to. Margaret exhaled through her nose, slow and even. Then she stood, picked up her purse, and without a word, walked out. Daniel sat there, stunned. Margaret. She didn't stop. Didn't look back. Charlotte reached for my arm. "Elias, please." I pulled away, slow and deliberate. "You lied to me." She closed her eyes, inhaling deep like she was trying to steady herself. "I didn't mean for this to happen." I let out a breath, shook my head. "That's the problem. You never do." She swallowed hard, looking at me, searching for something. "Maybe a way out. Maybe a second chance." I stood, took my plate to the sink, and started washing it like nothing had happened. Behind me, I heard Daniel push his chair back, scrambling after his wife. Charlotte stayed where she was, staring at the table like she could will herself back to 10 minutes ago. I let the water run over my hands, let the heat of it ground me. This was just the beginning. Charlotte didn't say much after that night. She stayed quiet, moving around the house like a ghost, keeping herself busy with chores that didn't need doing. I let her. If she wanted to pretend everything wasn't crumbling around her, that was her problem. I wasn't here to make her feel better about what she'd done. I spent the next few days at the forge, working harder than usual, letting the heat burn off any second thoughts. I knew what came next. This wasn't just about a broken marriage. It was about setting things right. When you spend your life working metal, you learn that weak spots don't fix themselves. You either work them out or you scrap the whole damn thing. That Friday night, Charlotte came into the workshop, arms crossed. "We need to talk." I barely glanced up from the anvil. "About what?" She sighed, stepping closer. "Elias, don't do this. We can fix things. You don't have to humiliate me." I set the hammer down and turned to her. "You humiliated yourself." She flinched but didn't look away. I made a mistake. Mistakes are accidents. This took effort. Her jaw tightened. So that's it? You're just done. I wiped my hands on a rag, my movement slow, deliberate. I'm not the one who walked away first. She stared at me, something desperate behind her eyes. Then she shook her head and left. I let her go. That night, I made a few phone calls. The house? Already on the market. Our joint accounts? Moved. Charlotte didn't know it yet, but by the time she did, it would be too late for her to do anything about it. The next evening, I invited some friends over, good men, honest men, the kind who understood loyalty and respect. Among them was Grant Hill, a local contractor who'd been talking about expanding his business. I handed him a drink, let the conversation flow, then casually mentioned that I was thinking about selling the house and putting my money into something new. He raised an eyebrow. That's so? I nodded, thinking about a fresh start. Grant sipped his beer, nodding slowly. Well, if you're looking for a quick sale, I might know a guy. That was all I needed. By the end of the night, I had a buyer lined up. By Monday, the papers were in motion. Charlotte found out when she came home and saw the real estate sign in the front yard. She stormed into the house, slamming the door behind her. Are you serious? I didn't look up from my paperwork. Very. You can't just sell our house without talking to me. I finally met her eyes. It's not ours. It's mine. She went pale. Elias, don't do this. Please. I leaned back in my chair, studying her. Why? So you can keep living here while sneaking off to Bellington? So I can be the fool who pretends nothing happened. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I felt nothing. I'd spent years loving this woman, building a life with her, and she threw it away for a man with soft hands and a sympathetic ear. I wasn't about to hand her an easy way out. She took a shaky breath. Where am I supposed to go? That's your problem. She let out a choked laugh, shaking her head. You really don't care, do you? I stood, towering over her, letting the weight of everything settle. I cared. And you killed that. For the first time since this all started, she had nothing to say. She just stood there, shoulders slumped, staring at the floor. I grabbed my keys and walked past her, out the door, leaving her in the house that wouldn't be hers much longer. By the end of the week, the sale was final. I didn't waste time. Charlotte came home from work one evening to find a letter on the counter, legal notice, plain and simple. The house belonged to someone else now. She had 2 weeks to pack up and leave. No discussion. No arguments. I got home late that night, expecting a fight. Instead, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, a half-empty glass of wine in front of her. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. You really went through with it, she said, voice flat. I grabbed a beer from the fridge and twisted off the cap. Told you I would. She let out a slow breath, running a hand through her hair. I don't know where to go. I leaned against the counter, taking a sip. Guess you should have thought about that before sneaking around with Harris. Her fingers tightened around the glass. I wasn't sneaking. I laughed short and sharp. You weren't honest. Same thing. She looked away, her jaw tightening. I could see her thinking, calculating, trying to figure out what to say to make this easier for herself. But there was no easy way out. She did this. After a long pause, she exhaled. What happens now? I shrugged. You leave. I stay. She let out a bitter laugh. Just like that. I nodded. Just like that. For a long time, she didn't speak. Just sat there, staring at the table. Maybe she thought I'd change my mind, that I'd cave and tell her we could work through this. She should have known better. I don't fix things that aren't worth fixing. 2 days later, the movers came. I wasn't home when she packed. Didn't need to be. The house wasn't hers anymore. Word spread fast. Small towns don't keep secrets. By the end of the week, everyone knew. Charlotte was leaving, Daniel Harris's wife had filed for divorce, and Harris himself had lost half his clients overnight. People don't trust a man who can't keep his own life in order. I ran into him at the hardware store a few days later. He saw me before I saw him, tried to duck into another aisle, but I wasn't about to let that happen. Harris. He stopped, shoulders stiff. Turned around slow, eyes wary. Elias. I took my time looking him over. He looked smaller than I remembered, like a man who'd been living off scraps. Good. Something on your mind? He asked, trying to sound casual. I stepped closer. Just wondering what kind of man screws up his life this bad over another man's wife. His jaw tightened. Look, save it. I wasn't interested in excuses. I leaned in, lowering my voice. You stay the hell out of my way. You so much as look in my direction, we're gonna have a real problem. You understand me? His throat bobbed. He nodded. I let the silence hang, then turned and walked away. Charlotte was gone by the end of the week. I didn't ask where she went. Didn't care. The house was mine again, empty but clean. Peaceful. I slept better that night than I had in years. Ironwood was a small town, and small towns had long memories. Charlotte might have thought leaving would give her a fresh start, but her name still carried weight here, and not in a good way. People talked. People remembered. And people watched what happened next. Margaret Harris had wasted no time filing for divorce, and Daniel was unraveling faster than a cheap nail in a bad heat. His accounting firm bled clients, one after another, until the office on Main Street sat half empty. Men who used to nod at him in the diner now looked through him. A couple of them, men whose wives were close to Margaret, made it clear they weren't looking to do business with a man who couldn't keep his own house in order. Good. I kept my head down and got back to work. The forge was steady, orders rolling in like always. The heat, the hammer, the rhythm of shaping something solid, that was all I needed. People came and went, some lingering longer than usual, trying to find a way to bring up what had happened. I let them. It didn't bother me. I hadn't done anything wrong. Granhill stopped by one afternoon, leaning against the workbench while I quenched a set of iron hinges for the new town library doors. He watched for a while before finally speaking. Heard Charlotte's in Bellington. Staying with her sister. I didn't look up. That's so. Yeah. Probably thinks she can start over. I set the tongs down, wiped my hands on a rag. She can do whatever she wants. She's not my problem anymore. Grant nodded, crossing his arms. Hell of a way to go out, though. Whole town saw what you did. Not a lot of men would have handled it like that. I met his eyes. You mean without losing my damn mind? He smirked. Something like that. He glanced at the forge, then back at me. So what now? I shrugged. Same as always. Work. Build. Move forward. He nodded like he approved, then pushed off the bench. Well, if you ever need a drink, let me know. I just nodded and got back to work. That night I walked through town, same as I always had. Stopped by the diner, grabbed a coffee, sat by the window, and watched the street. People still nodded at me, still talked like nothing had changed. And in a way, nothing had. I wasn't the one who left. I wasn't the one who broke anything. I was still here, still standing. And that was enough. Winter came early that year. The first frost set in before the leaves had finished falling, and the forge was the warmest place in town. I kept the fire going longer than usual, staying late, taking on more orders than I needed. Work kept my hands busy, my mind sharp. One night, just as I was locking up, I saw a familiar figure across the street. Margaret Harris, standing outside the hardware store, arms crossed, her breath curling in the cold air. I hadn't spoken to her since the dinner that ended it all. I nodded in her direction. Margaret. She looked over, studying me for a second, then crossed the street. Elias. I waited. She wasn't the kind of woman to waste words. She glanced at the forge behind me. Bet you're staying busy. Always. She nodded like she expected that answer. Daniel's leaving town. I didn't react. That's so. Yeah. Some job offer in the city. No one here's hiring him, and I made sure he got the worst end of the divorce. I smirked. Good for you. She exhaled, shaking her head. Can't believe I was married to that idiot for 15 years. People see what they want to see. She looked at me then, really looked like she was measuring something. You ever think about leaving? I shook my head. No reason to. Margaret smiled, small and sharp. Figures. We stood there for a moment, the cold settling between us, then she pulled her coat tighter and turned to leave. See you around, Elias. I watched her walk away, then headed home. The next morning I started something new. A personal project. It had been years since I made something just for the sake of making it, but this felt right. A gate, tall, solid, strong. The kind of thing that stands for generations. People came by, watched me work, asked what it was for. I told them the truth. It's for the town. By the time it was finished, it was the best damn thing I'd ever made. We set it up at the entrance to Ironwood, welded into place, unmoving, unshakable. Charlotte was gone. Harris was gone. But I was still here. And I always would be. A year passed and Ironwood remained the same. The town didn't care about personal failures, didn't stop moving for broken marriages or men who lost their way. It just kept going, the way it always had. That suited me fine. The forge stayed busy, my name carried more weight than ever, and I never once looked back. Charlotte never returned. Last I heard, she was still in Bellington, bouncing between jobs, trying to outrun the reputation that followed her. Ironwood had a long memory, but small towns weren't the only places where people talked. She'd learned that the hard way. Harris was gone too. Took that job in the city, probably still looking over his shoulder, waiting for the next time his life fell apart. His old office had been turned into a bakery, and I made a point to buy my coffee there just to see the name scraped off the glass. Margaret thrived. She got the house, most of their savings, and a new sense of freedom she hadn't had in years. When I saw her, she looked lighter, stronger. Once we ran into each other at the diner, and she bought my coffee without asking. "Least I could do," she said, taking a sip from her own cup. I nodded. "Appreciate it." She smirked. "You should." Then she got up and left, just like that. The gate stood tall at the entrance of town, black iron twisted into something strong, permanent. People called it the Holt Gate. They asked why I built it, and I gave them the same answer every time. Because things that last matter. That was all there was to it. One evening I stood at the forge after hours, staring into the fire, feeling the heat soak into my bones. The town was quiet, the workday done. The house was mine, the business was mine, and every damn thing I had, I built with my own hands. I gripped a hammer, tested its weight, and smiled. Some things you mend. Some things you scrap. Either way, you move forward.